Imagine walking into a quiet anatomy lab expecting nothing more than the usual rows of specimens, only to find someone holding a fetus in their hands, ready to walk out the back door. Sounds unbelievable, right? Like a scene from a thriller movie. But this actually happened. Someone really tried to steal a fetus that had been preserved for decades. Why? Because they believed they could take better care of it than the very scientists who had been safeguarding it for years. This shocking event raises questions no one usually dares to ask. Who truly has the right to protect a donated body? Is it emotion or science that ensures respect for the dead? Welcome to the Wellness Way. Today I'm going to take you inside a story that's not just bizarre, but deeply human. It's a story about life, death, science, and the delicate balance between care and control. Once you hear it, you'll never think about body donation or the ethics of science the same way again. So if you're ready to be challenged, intrigued, and maybe even a little unsettled, stick around. And before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to The Wellness Way. Your support keeps us bringing powerful, thought-provoking stories like this to life. When most people imagine a theft, they think of stolen jewelry, a car, or maybe even priceless art. But I want you to pause and picture something entirely different. The attempted theft of a fetus. Not a grown body, not a skeleton, but a small fetus preserved in a jar, quietly resting in an anatomy lab. It sounds almost surreal, like a storyline ripped from a dark television drama. Yet this is not fiction. It's a true story that unfolded in a place dedicated not to crime or chaos, but to learning and the respectful study of human anatomy. The story begins with something many of us take for granted: trust. When families make the decision to donate bodies or specimens to science, they place enormous trust in the people who receive them. They trust that their loved one will be treated with care, with dignity, and that their body will contribute to something larger than themselves: education, research, the advancement of human understanding. In this case, the fetus in question had been part of that mission for decades. It was estimated to be between 26 and 30 weeks of development when it passed, nearly into the third trimester. At that stage, most of the body's structures are fully formed, and the growth that follows is more about size than creation. To look at it was to see a tiny but complete human, with arms, legs, ears, even the delicate details of a face. And yet, despite how small it was, this little body had carried an outsized impact. It had been donated more than 40 years ago, passed from one educator to another, until finally resting in the lab where this incident took place. Over that time, it had educated thousands of students in person and millions more through videos online. People had seen it, marveled at it, and walked away with a greater appreciation for the fragile miracle of life. This fetus was not simply a specimen, it had become a teacher. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. A few years back, the lab featured the fetus in a YouTube video. For the most part, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Viewers were inspired, moved, and curious. Some even said they wanted to donate their own bodies to science after seeing how meaningful such donations could be. But there was one viewer who saw something entirely different. This person noticed that the level of fluid in the jar seemed lower than before, and they interpreted this as neglect. To them, it looked as though the lab wasn't taking proper care of the fetus. Now, on the surface, this might sound like a small misunderstanding. After all, fluid levels in preserved specimens can fluctuate slightly over the years. It's usually not a problem and doesn't automatically mean negligence. But this particular viewer took it very seriously, so seriously in fact, that they decided something had to be done. And here's where it gets complicated. This viewer wasn't just some random person on the internet. They actually worked in the same building as the lab. They had been inside the lab before, had seen the fetus during teaching sessions, and apparently felt a growing conviction that they needed to intervene. Imagine the mindset, believing that the scientists responsible were failing and that you alone had the right to rescue the fetus. It's a powerful blend of concern, emotion, and, whether they realized it or not, arrogance. Instead of asking more questions, instead of trusting the years of expertise behind the preservation, this person decided to act. And so one day they did. They entered the lab through a back entrance, bypassing the usual flow of people. This wasn't a casual visit, it was deliberate. They went straight for the fetus, lifted the jar and prepared to walk away with it. Think about that for a second. A specimen that had been entrusted to science for decades, safeguarded carefully and used to teach generations, was suddenly in the hands of someone who was not authorized, not trained, and not equipped to care for it. Had they succeeded, the fetus could have been damaged, exposed, or even lost forever. Thankfully, fate intervened. One of the lab team members, Justin, happened to be there that day. Hearing movement in the back room, he went to investigate, and what he found must have been shocking. There stood the individual, fetus in hand, calmly explaining that arrangements had been made to take the specimen to another university where supposedly it would be better cared for. Justin didn't buy it. He confronted the person, and what followed was a tense back and forth. The individual insisted. Justin stood his ground, and in the end the fetus stayed where it belonged. The person left empty-handed, their mission thwarted. When I reflect on this moment, I can't help but think about how close it came to disaster. If Justin hadn't been there, the fetus might have disappeared. The lab could have discovered its absence days later, with students scheduled to learn from it and nothing left to show. It would have sparked police involvement, investigations, security checks, and an irreplaceable loss to science and education. What makes this story even more compelling, though, is what happened afterward. The lab leadership met with the individual alongside supervisors from the building. During the meeting, the person broke down. They weren't related to the fetus in any way, but they admitted to having an emotional attachment. They cried, expressed remorse, and claimed their actions had come from a place of concern rather than malice. Now, I want to pause here because this is where my personal reflection comes in. On one hand, I can understand how emotion can drive people to do extreme things. To that individual, the fetus wasn't just a preserved body. It was a symbol of life, of fragility, of something that needed protection. But on the other hand, I can't excuse the action itself. To walk into a lab, take something that doesn't belong to you, and risk destroying years of careful preservation, that isn't protection. That's interference. That's harm disguised as care. And so the lab team had to find a balance. They didn't press charges, but they made it clear. This was unacceptable. They also took steps to prevent it from happening again. Security measures were upgraded, access was tightened, and the fetus was placed behind an additional locked door. The message was firm yet compassionate. The fetus was safe. It was being cared for properly, and no one needed to rescue it. For me, this story is more than just an odd anecdote about a stolen specimen. It's a lesson about perception versus reality. From the outside, things can look one way, a slightly lower fluid level, a misunderstanding about preservation, but the truth requires deeper knowledge, patience, and trust in science. Emotion alone isn't enough to guide us, especially when lives, or in this case legacies, are at stake. And that brings me back to the opening image, a fetus in a jar, small and fragile, yet powerful enough to stir such strong feelings in people. To some, it's unsettling. To others, it's sacred. To me, it's a reminder of two things: the incredible journey of human development and the responsibility we carry when entrusted with the bodies of those who can no longer speak for themselves. So, when I hear this story, I don't just think about the near theft. I think about what it represents: the thin line between care and control, the need to respect science as much as sentiment, and above all, the duty we all share to protect not just the living, but the lessons left behind by the dead. There are moments in life when something small and seemingly ordinary forces us to stop and reconsider everything we thought we knew. For me, one of those moments came when I first saw the preserved fetus in the anatomy lab. It was tiny, so delicate that you could hold it in one hand, yet unmistakably human. You could see the arms, the legs, the little ears forming on the sides of the head, even the faint outline of facial features. This wasn't just tissue suspended in fluid. This was the silent evidence of a life that had begun, but never had the chance to continue. That image alone carries weight, but what struck me even more was the story surrounding it. This fetus wasn't new to the lab. It had been there for more than 4 decades, passed along from educator to educator like a sacred trust. Over that time, it had touched the lives of countless students. Imagine thousands of young people studying medicine or biology, crowding around the jar, seeing with their own eyes what textbooks could only describe. And imagine millions more who encountered it, online, where the lab shared its lessons with the world. That little body, which never saw the light of day, had become a teacher of life itself. But that's what made the attempted theft so shocking. Because when you see the fetus not as a specimen, but as a teacher, you realize just how devastating it would have been to lose it. The tension really began with perception. A few years back, when the fetus was shown in an online video, most people were fascinated and moved. They left comments about how amazing the human body is, how grateful they were to see something so rare, and how inspired they felt to continue learning. But one viewer fixated on something else: the fluid in the jar. To their eyes, it looked like the level had dropped, and they concluded that the lab wasn't caring for the fetus properly. I can understand how, from a distance, that might spark concern. But here's where emotion collided with expertise. The lab staff knew exactly what was happening. Over years, fluid levels can shift slightly. It's normal. It doesn't mean the body is neglected, and it certainly doesn't mean it's in danger. But to the person who saw that video, it became an obsession. They believed they had caught the lab in the act of failing its duty. And this wasn't just any viewer. This individual worked in the same building. They had seen the fetus before during classes. They felt close to it, maybe even protective. That emotional bond, combined with suspicion, pushed them toward a decision that still baffles me. They were going to take matters into their own hands. One ordinary day, when no one expected trouble, they slipped into the lab through a back entrance. That detail still sticks with me. They didn't walk in the front like a visitor. They chose the back, as if even they knew what they were doing was wrong. Inside, they went straight to the fetus, lifted the jar and prepared to carry it out. Think about the audacity of that. This wasn't theirs to take. This wasn't a forgotten object collecting dust in a corner. It was a carefully preserved body, entrusted to science, with layers of responsibility surrounding it. And yet, in that moment, it was nothing more than a container in someone's hands, seconds away from disappearing. What stopped the theft was not a lock or a camera. It was a person. Justin, one of the lab team members, happened to be there preparing for video work. Hearing the noise in the back, he went to check. And there, in front of him, was the shocking sight. Someone holding the fetus, mid-theft. I tried to put myself in his shoes. Shock would be the first reaction, anger the second. And then a flood of questions. Who are you? Why are you here? What do you think you're doing? But Justin didn't freeze. He confronted the person, demanding an explanation. The explanation he got was surreal. The individual calmly said that they were taking the fetus to another university, where it would be better cared for. They claimed arrangements had been made. They framed it not as theft, but as a rescue. This is the part of the story that unsettles me most, because on one level it's almost absurd. No, you cannot just walk into a lab and take a specimen because you think you know better. But on another level, it reveals something deeper, the danger of confusing emotional conviction with genuine responsibility. The thief believed they were doing the right thing, but belief doesn't change reality. In reality, they were jeopardizing decades of preservation, undermining trust, and risking the destruction of something irreplaceable. Thankfully, Justin stood firm. The two went back and forth, but he never budged. Eventually, the would-be thief gave up and left. But even then, the damage wasn't just physical, it was emotional. When the story reached the rest of the lab team, the reaction was outrage mixed with disbelief. How could someone who had seen their work up close, who knew the care they put into every body, assume they were careless? How could someone violate the trust of the lab so casually? The aftermath revealed even more layers. A meeting was arranged with supervisors. In that meeting, the individual broke down. They weren't related to the fetus, but they confessed to having an emotional attachment. They cried. They expressed regret. They seemed genuinely sorry. And here's where the story softens, at least a little. The lab chose not to press charges. They could have. They had every right. But instead they emphasized what mattered most. The fetus was safe. It had always been safe, and their responsibility was to continue caring for it as they had for years. At the same time, they strengthened security, adding new locks, checking key card access, ensuring it could never happen again. When I reflect on this, I see two truths colliding. On one hand, the thief's emotion was real. They saw the fetus as something fragile and precious, and they wanted to protect it. But on the other hand, their method of protection was destructive. You can't claim to honor something while endangering it. You can't claim to respect science while undermining the people who practice it. The bigger lesson for me is about balance. Science needs compassion. It reminds us why the work matters. But compassion without knowledge can be reckless. And knowledge without compassion can feel cold. True care requires both. That fetus was not just a jar of tissue, nor was it a living child in need of rescue. It was something in between, a gift, a legacy, a bridge between life and learning. And protecting that requires humility, respect, and trust in the process. As strange as it may sound, I'm almost grateful the attempted theft happened, because it forced everyone involved, and even those of us hearing the story later, to confront what really matters. It reminded us that behind every specimen is a story. Behind every jar is a life that was lived, however briefly. And behind every act of preservation is a promise to honor that life by teaching others. Every story has a turning point, and in this case, the turning point came not from drama or confrontation, but from reflection. After the attempted theft, after the confrontation and the meeting with supervisors, the fetus remained in the lab. But its meaning grew larger than ever before. For those who worked with it daily, it became more than just a specimen. It became a symbol of what it means to be entrusted with something fragile, irreplaceable, and deeply human. The lab staff didn't see themselves as mere technicians. They saw themselves as stewards. When you are responsible for donated bodies, you carry a weight that is difficult to explain. These are not objects. They are people who once lived, or in the case of the fetus, a life that nearly began. Their families or caretakers entrusted them to science for a reason, so that others might learn, discover, and carry forward knowledge. That responsibility is sacred. This is why the idea that someone accused them of neglect cut so deeply. For years they had gone above and beyond to ensure dignity in every process. They kept meticulous records, kept tissues separated, and honoured protocols so that when the time came, remains could be cremated and returned to families. They even knew the names and causes of death of the adult donors. To them, care was not just physical, it was personal. And yet, despite all of this, one person's perception nearly derailed it. That's the paradox of human behaviour. We want to do good. We want to protect. But sometimes our idea of protection blinds us to the bigger picture. The individual who tried to take the fetus may have felt like a hero in that moment, but what they risked was far greater. The integrity of education, the trust of donors, the continuation of knowledge. For me, this raises an uncomfortable question. How do we measure respect for the dead? Is it through silence, leaving them undisturbed? Or is it through activity, using their remains to teach, to advance, to save lives indirectly? It's not an easy question, and people will answer it differently depending on their values. But for the lab, the answer was clear. Respect meant preservation and purpose. It meant allowing the fetus to keep teaching, to keep inspiring, even decades after its life had ended. This is where the story widens into something universal, because it's not just about one fetus in one lab. It's about the way we, as humans, handle the tension between emotion and science, between tradition and progress. We live in a time where science is both celebrated and doubted, where personal feelings can clash with collective knowledge. The theft attempt was a microcosm of that larger conflict. It was the personal colliding with the professional, the emotional clashing with the rational. And yet, what came out of it was clarity. The lab doubled down on its mission. Security was improved. Access was restricted. The fetus was placed behind an additional locked door, not to hide it, but to safeguard it, ensuring that it could continue to serve its role as a teacher. What could have been a tragedy instead became a reminder. This work matters, and it cannot be taken for granted. I find myself thinking often about the family who originally donated the fetus decades ago. We don't know much about them. We don't know the circumstances of the pregnancy or what led to its end. But we do know one thing. They chose science. They chose to give this small body a second life, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that continues to ripple outward. Students who studied that fetus went on to become doctors, nurses, educators. People who watched the lab's videos online left with a deeper sense of wonder about their own bodies. That is legacy. That is impact. And so, when I hear about the attempted theft, I can't help but feel gratitude that it was stopped. because losing the fetus would have meant losing part of that legacy. It would have meant breaking the chain of learning that has carried on for decades. In some ways, it would have been like erasing a voice from history, a voice that, even in silence, still teaches. This is why body donation matters. It's not about morbid curiosity or cold science. It's about the generosity of giving, about allowing your body, or in this case your child, to continue making a difference after death. It's about teaching future generations not just facts, but values, respect, humility, appreciation for the miracle of life. For the lab, this event reinforced their mission. Every time they unlock that door and bring out the fetus to teach, they do so with renewed seriousness. They know how easily it could have been lost, and that knowledge sharpens their gratitude. They remind their students not to see it as just a specimen, but as a rare gift that must be honoured. They know that without such gifts, the next generation of healers and thinkers would be learning in the dark. On a personal level, this story forces me to examine my own relationship with science and mortality. Would I be willing to donate my body? Would I trust strangers to care for it, to use it wisely, to honour it? And do I have the humility to accept that once given, it is no longer mine, but the world's? These are difficult questions, but I think they are worth asking, because in the end, this isn't just a story about theft. It's a story about choice. The choice of a family to donate, the choice of a lab to preserve and teach, the misguided choice of an individual to interfere, and the choice we all face, to see death as an end or as an opportunity to give life in a different form, through knowledge, through education, through legacy. So yes, the fetus remains in the lab. It remains locked away, safe, waiting for the next class of students to gather around it with wide eyes and open minds. And every time that happens, the story grows a little bigger. It's no longer just about a near theft. It's about resilience. It's about the persistence of knowledge. And above all, it's about the extraordinary ways in which life, even when cut short, can continue to matter. When I look back on this story, what lingers with me is not just the shock of an attempted theft, but the deeper questions it forces us to ask about life, science, and respect. A small fetus, preserved for decades, became the centre of a moment that revealed both the best and the most fragile parts of human nature. On one side, you have scientists dedicating their lives to honouring donors, preserving their bodies and teaching generations of students. On the other, you have someone whose emotions led them to believe they were protecting that same fetus, even as their actions risked destroying it. For me, the real takeaway is this: caring for the dead is not simply about preservation, and respecting life is not simply about emotion. True respect requires balance. It means combining compassion with knowledge, humility with responsibility. When those elements come together, something beautiful happens. The dead continue to teach the living. That is the miracle of body donation. Personally, I find this story humbling. It reminds me of how easy it is to let emotion override reason, how easy it is to convince ourselves we're doing the right thing when, in fact, we're causing harm. But it also shows the power of patience, professionalism, and trust in science. The lab didn't retaliate with anger or punishment. Instead, they responded with clarity, reaffirming their mission and strengthening their commitment. That kind of integrity is rare, and it's inspiring. The fetus itself stands as a powerful symbol. It never grew into adulthood, never took its first breath, yet it has touched more lives than many of us will in a lifetime. Every student who studied it, every viewer who watched a video about it, every person who walked away with a deeper respect for the human body, Each of them is part of its legacy. To me, that's the ultimate lesson. Life's value is not measured by length, but by impact. So what do we do with that lesson? I think we apply it by living with more intention, by remembering that our choices, however small, ripple outward, by respecting the gifts others leave behind, whether it's knowledge, kindness, or, in this extraordinary case, their very bodies, and by choosing to see science not as something cold or distant, but as a way of honouring life itself. Now, I want to turn this over to you. What do you think? When it comes to body donation, or even just respecting the dead, what matters more, emotion or science? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share your perspective in the comments. Your voice adds to the conversation, and we can all learn from one another. And if you found this story meaningful, if it made you think differently about science, legacy, or life itself, then I invite you to subscribe to The Wellness Way. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the video ends.